Greetings and welcome to Ancestral Recall. I'm your host, Eli Kaplan. In this Magic show, we explore and analyze 20 years of Magic's history. Last time, we started looking at 2002's Onslaught, assessing the set's mechanics, story, and two famous cycles. Now, if you want to get the full story, click on the link and go watch it before watching this video. I can wait. Caught up? Cool. Today we're going to look at lots of fascinating cards that were power players in Standard, Extended, or maybe right for your Cubes, Pauper, or EDH decks. We'll also talk about the financial elements and give the set its final score. But first, let's actually open up a booster, huh?
Okay, so to highlight what it's like to open up one of these packs, I've got an Onslaught booster. And let's get to it. Alright, so I picked these up at GP Philly. Alright, let's see what we get. Alright. Crown of Suspicion. Grassland Crusader. Charging Slateback. Choking Tethers. Taunting Elf. Siphon Mind. Demystify. Misformed Dreamer. Snarling Underack. SWAT. Now we're in our uncommons. Prowling Pangolin. Aven Soulgazer. Oh, we got a foil. Explosive Vegetation. And our rare is Rotlung Reanimator. Okay, cool. And our foil, we got... Oh! You are shocked. Nice foil. Well, I mean, it's not worth anything, but... Okay. So, first pick. I really like the Reanimator in Cleric decks. And we've got another Cleric that's 6, which is kind of expensive, but sometimes it wheels. So far, let's see, what else here? Shock. Some people like it, but it's not a first pick. This is a pretty decently big morph. Choking Tethers it gives you reach, but... Let's see, Siphon Mind, not good enough. Demystify, lousy. 2/1 flyers, Misformed Dreamer lets you hack it into the thing you like. I do like that. Here we've got Snarling Underact. That does get pretty big. That's arguably a first pick. Although you want to play it face up. SWAT can be okay. Prowling Pangolin, a little dangerous. Especially if they have lots of tokens out. A 3/3 flyer. Yeah, so we've got actually quite a few good picks here. So, I think my pick is going to be... Gosh, you know, this format's slow enough. Generally speaking, I just love 3/3 flyers for 5 back in the days. These days it's, you know, not quite as good on the curve, but yeah, I gotta go with Soulgazer. It definitely gives you some information advantage over the game. All right.
If you disagree with my first pick logic, feel free to say so in the comments. This isn't the science after all, and now it's time to do our single card profiles. Get up on it like this. Akroma's Vengeance. This card was so important with Mirrodin's release, because if you could ramp up to 6 mana while staying alive against Affinity, Akroma's Vengeance was game over, man. Game over. Now, this spell did not fit very well into most Astral slide decks, because it ended up blowing up the controller's key enchantments. But it was a handy reset button in traditional blue-white control decks, and it was also pretty awesome in the mirror match. Aurification. This was a clever attempt at remaking Urza's Legacy's No Mercy, except in white instead of black. When an enemy damaged you, it turned into a golden wall and gained Defender. Creatures still kept their tap abilities, however, so I'm pretty sure that you're better off with the original. Aven Brigadier. 2 lords in 1. Now, there aren't many lords who pump up 2 different creature types. Lavisa Cold Eyes is the only one that comes to mind to me right now, but I'm sure there's more. Also, Flying Lords are sweet. Aven Soulgazer. I love the flavor on this card. He's a cheeky guy who can peek at your opponent's morphs, giving you tactical information. In group games at the time, I would often use this guy to manipulate the flow of battle by occasionally peeking at a morph and then lying to the group to see what they do with this information. Usually I tell the truth. Usually. Sometimes other players would come begging to me to tell them what the morph was. Now, this ability is utterly irrelevant in most formats, but man, back in the day, it was nice to be an actual information broker. Catapult Squad. Unlike the rare cycle of lords with mass tap abilities, this guy only requires 2 soldiers. Now, this squad was fairly easy to come by as an uncommon, and with bear-like stats, it was fine in the early game too. Now, this card has been outmoded by current standards. Daru Lancer was one of the most common morphs of the day. Flipping it over after opponents blocked on turn 4 almost always profited. Daunting Defender. Now, this guy was an incredibly brutal defensive card in multiples and limited. Get out 2 or 3, what is your opponent going to be able to do to stop your guys? Now, this card actually got referenced in Future Sight when they printed Lymph Sliver. Now, I love this ability, but man, it's expensive. Now, every set has stupid broken rares and limited. Exalted Angel was an Onslaught's poster child. Since the Angel didn't get any tribal benefits, Wizards said, hey, we can make this extra beefy. It gets a hit for 4 lifelink damage in the air on turn 4, yeah, sure. Exalted Angel was a nightmare to see on the other side of the table, and still occasionally sees play in EDH and other casual formats. As a general rule, if you see something in Onslaught that isn't in one of the key tribes, you know it's powerful. Glarecaster is an absolute terror in Momer Basic. The redirection ability is just nutty. I've won a couple of games in Momer with this guy. This was an utter and complete thrashing in Limited. There were 5 different Gust Cloak guys in this set. Now, if one of these guys got blocked disadvantageously, they could withdraw from combat and untap to boot. The one I liked drafting the most was Gust Cloak Carrier because it had proper Windrake stats. I really like Windrakes. In Limited, anyway. One tool many Commander players have used to shut down abusive generals is shuffling these threats back into their library, keeping them from returning to the command zone. It's known as tucking. And the first card to tuck was Ablation. This card had the downside of the tucked permanence controller drawing 2 cards. They might even draw the card that you just shuffled away, but if you're dealing with a nightmare of a general like Skithrix, or Kalia, or Memnarch, or Olivia Valarin, giving them 2 cards and just denying them that giant nuisance is well worth it. By the way, all those generals I just named, I loathe them. This set saw blue stealing something it normally didn't bother to, lands. Annex was a 4-mana land theft spell that found its way into blue-red Wildfire decks. The deck ran Stone Rain, Annex, Boomerang, and Wildfire, and counter magic. Now, Annex wasn't the first spell specifically dedicated to stealing a land from its controller, however. That honor would go to Ice Age's Conquer. This color pie shift feels right, but I'll tell you, I still hate land destruction. Blatant Thievery is a great group game card. For each opponent, you get to steal something from them. If your EDH table's getting out of control with things like Memnarch, Avacyn, or Akroma's Memorial, or something that's just crushing everybody's fun, well, this card is a great response. Of course, you'll build up some resentment yourself, so I suggest taking a less offensive card from the players who you don't want to tick off. You could be wrecking them, but you're not. That gets reserved for Captain Misery over there. One of the less known spells in Onslaught that still gets play in Vintage and Legacy is Chain of Vapor, a fun game within a game that allows players to keep bouncing permanents at the cost of losing lands. Now, Retaliation usually wasn't the best choice, but sometimes the spell gets to turn games upside down. After getting a timeout in the corner for some years, Clone got put back in the game with Onslaught, this time with new art. Now today, with cards like Progenitor Mimic and Phyrexian Metamorph added to the mix in the last couple of years, newer players might get the impression that Wizards has always been fine with copy cards. That wasn't the case. After Revised, Wizards stopped doing copy cards until Onslaught. That's a period of 6 or 7 years. Now the real reason copy cards got sidelined was rules templating issues, but Clone was Wizards' way of showing that they finally got the rules down right. Future Sight was the first enchantment that gave players a real reward for playing with the top card of their library revealed. They get to play it. So this led the way to designs like Oracle of Moldiah and Courser of Kruphix. Now, I love Future Sight, but that triple blue, that's pretty demanding. This was a staple in control decks. Onslaught features one of Magic's more famous invitational cards, Void Mage Prodigy. Now, this card was designed by first ballot Hall of Famer Kai Bude after his invitational win. Now, the Prodigy stands out among invitational cards because it's the first one to get a second piece of art. Kai did not like the armor design of his card, saying that he looked fat. And yeah, I get his point. Wizards sent out a new version as a player rewards card. Now in terms of power level, Kai was not a big hit. He didn't have evasion like Finkel. He didn't become a staple in Modern like Tiago Chan. He didn't search out multiple creatures like Olivier Rouel's card. Oh well, them's the breaks. Kai did have some utility in wizard-themed decks, though. Supreme Inquisitor was the Wizard Lord, and wizards don't care about power or toughness, oh no. The Inquisitor and 4 faculty colleagues could strip the 5 best spells out of your opponent's deck every turn. Now this card often got coupled in Standard with another supremely annoying son of a gun, Odyssey's Patron Wizard. With a wall of wizards out, opponents would never get a word in edgewise. And if they didn't play a spell, well, that's when the Inquisitor went to town. Wheel and Deal was the first attempt after Memory Jar to print a card that let players refill their hands by drawing 7. Well, your opponent gets 7. You get 1. I don't understand why this card never really got broken. Entrails Feaster is Magic's first zombie cat. Ugh. I can has brains, I guess? Festering Goblin is not the first Black Goblin. That honor goes to Marsh Goblins, from the Dark. But Festering Goblin was one of the best 1-drops in the format. It traded with most 2 or 3 drops, and it helped set the precedent for Lorwyn-Block's Black-Red Goblins. This guy even saw play in the Black-Red Patriarch's Bidding deck that was a hit in Standard. One of the set's marquee cards, Grinning Demon, was a callback to Arabian Nights' Juzam Jin. For the same cost as Juzam Jin, you get a 6/6. Way above the baseline, but Grinning Demon did have a serious upkeep costs. Now you could circumvent it a little while by using Morph and then turning it up after it got through unblocked. This guy did not play nice with anybody, even its controller. While Red has long had mass creature removal like Earthquake or Pyroclasm, Black started getting into the act with Infest. This was a windmill slam in draft and frequently got first picked. It wiped the board clean of pretty much every tribe except for beasts and some zombies and clerics. If you're looking for a cheap, reliable raised dead component in EDH, it's really hard to go wrong with Oversold Cemetery. Every upkeep, as long as there are 4 or more dead guys in your bin, the cemetery returns one of your choice back to your hand. This is a control player's nightmare. Now if you love Mimeoplasm as much as I do, then you want to use the plasm to copy your opponent's stuff through mass mill and removal, while getting the choicest out of your own yard with this card. Another casual staple that Onslaught gave us was Black's Patriarch's Bidding, a card that brought back a tribe of each player's choice from the yard, all of them. Now, in Standard, the tribe that got the most utility out of sacrificing itself and thus getting maximum value out of the bidding was Red's Goblins, thanks to Goblin Sluther, Skirk Prospector, and an unhealthy level of disregard for green skin safety. Goblin Bidding was one of the premier aggro decks that also had a strong combo component. I remember watching Tsuyoshi Fujita pilot it to great effects at Japanese Nationals. Rotlung Reanimator was one of the staples of the Black Cleric deck. This spell gave you free 2/2 zombies after it kicked the dust. This was a great preemptive move against Wrath of God, and it also partnered well with Cabal Archon, another gruesome Dark Cleric that profited by slaying its siblings. Now, I played the Black Cleric deck in Standard and partnered this combination with 8th edition's Grave Pact. It worked like a charm. Silent Spectre was the pre-release foil and was straightforward. A double Hypnotic Spectre. It had double the stats, double the cost, and double the discard power. Okay, now the discards were selective, not random. But when you're hitting 2 cards at a time, the difference is minute. Now the real terror behind the Spectre was that it was a morph, which meant that any innocuous face-down 2/2 could potentially ravage your hand on turn 5. For the classic Red Deck Wins player, Onslaught offers Blistering Firecat, hitting for a hasty 7, or simply upgrading a swing from a 2/2. The Firecat offers a whole host of tactical options that Ball Lightning never did. But Ball Lightning has stood the test of time and this hasn't. Why? Well, Ball Lightning costs 1 colorless less. Sorry, but that's the power of economy. Okay, story time. Magic has had several mascots throughout the game's history. Go look up the old Magic television ads on YouTube, and you'll find luchadors with chainsaws, giant pink talking mutant poodles pushing a mail cart, and the Org. Oh yeah, Orgs. Now, this variant on goblins, which looked vaguely goblinish, but wasn't, well, Orgs had 4 arms, an incredibly bad attitude, and hated Bob from accounting.
Calling the Org and the Raging Goblin. What? The Goblin's out sick? Well, send in Bob from accounting. First round goes to the org.
The original org came from Fallen Empires and was remarkably hard to send into the red zone, but the Onslaught version, Butcher Org, got to deal its damage any way it wanted when it attacked. You could also use its ability to assign damage to your own guys when it was on defense, but that would be silly, usually. I've gotten this to work before, though, with Lorwyn's Vigor. Now, at 7 mana, you have better options, but sure. But Butcher Org's intimidating art and fascinating pedigree deserve a second look. And now, a moment of silence for Bob from accounting. Oh, he could crunch the numbers well, and he always had a good story to share at the water cooler. He left behind a wife and 2 loving children. And a 1/1 spirit token because Bob's controller also had a Requiem Angel out. We will miss him very much. There used to be a card in Magic that cost 5 and spat out 1/1 Flying Wasp tokens called the Hive. It was Magic's first token producer. Now, Wizards has printed many over the years, but the first time they decided to print a token producer that made big, and I do mean big, tokens was Dragon Roost. Now, with 12 mana, it's a huge investment for the first dragon, but if it gets online, look out. This is like buying the green properties in Monopoly. You know what's better than 1 Prodigal Sorcerer, 2, or 3? And you could get multiples with Ember Mage Goblin, which let you search your library for another copy as soon as it hit play. Alas, this card was too expensive to work, as well as I hoped when it came out. Now, Magic has some scary 2-drops. Wild Mongrel, Arcbound Ravager, Tarmogoyf, Dark Confidant. And then there's one in Legacy that only shows up once in a while, but leaves their opponents rattled and distraught. We're talking about Goblin Piledriver. Now, if you can spit out hasty, fast goblins, thanks to Goblin Warchief or Lackey, the Piledriver can hit for 3, 5, or in some cases, 11 damage on turn 3. Good God, I mean, that's just crazy. The Piledriver also had protection from blue to boot. Now, this card is much more narrow than Tarmogoyf or Snapcaster Mage, but there are a few 2-drops that can shovel out so much damage on turns 3 and 4. Goblin Sharpshooter may have had some non-fantasy flavor in its first printing, but I loved it nonetheless. This was a really great card against the scourge of Onslaught Mirrodin Standard, Affinity. This card took down Disciples of the Vault, Arcbound Workers, and on occasion, Arcbound Ravager. You had to be really careful with its triggers, though. By the way, I love the new art printed in Commander 2013, my favorite art of this set. Now, I'm sorry, I gotta say this. When it comes to Commander, I think there really should be only one way to win. Not combo, not by control, and not by making everything you own utterly broken, indestructible, flying, and infinitely lethal. No. The classy way to win is to smash people with armies. Now, I may be a Spike at heart, but when it comes to EDH, that's where I let my inner Timmy roar. And they printed a card that perfectly pleases both Timmy and Spike, Insurrection. It may be a crappy Star Trek movie, but taking over all creatures at once, making giant lethal attacks, now that's what I want in my EDH games. There are closers, but Insurrection is the closer's closer. Kaboom! Is the only Magic card with an exclamation mark in its name. Honestly, I feel uncomfortable saying the name of this card without extra emphasis. Kaboom? Just doesn't feel right. Now, if you've seen Kill Bill, you'll also remember it as a cereal with a perverse prize in it. Seriously, how did they get that cereal onto the market? Sorry, Kaboom's not that interesting a spell, but I have an interest in orthography. Let's get this out of the way. I hate playing red and constructed, and I don't like burn spells to the dome. They're healthy for the game, I'm going to say that, but that doesn't mean I like burn spells. But there were many, many, many years when red mages felt like Wizards was taunting them every time they printed Shock. You don't deserve Lightning Bolt, they heard. Lightning Bolt is just too good for you. These players got angry, which does fit red, the color of passion. And so when Wizards did eventually print Lightning Bolt in M10, well, that took a lot of getting used to. The rage was taken away. And then everyone else was complaining about it. Anyway, when Onslaught came out, people complained about Shock. It's always playable, you shouldn't complain about it, but that is the nature of being Shock. Skirk Prospector was a terrifying card that allowed lots of combos in Standard. This card was able to churn out big armies quickly with Siege Gang Commander. We already talked about Naturalize being an example of Onslaught shifting a key stable ability to a new color, but Threaten was the first time Red got access to temporary steal effects. Borrowing a creature for a turn originated in blue with Ice Age's Ray of Command. Ray of Command could borrow a creature and block with it in the middle of combat, reflecting blue's tricky nature. Now red got the effect for 1 less mana, but had to do with its sorcery speed. Red doesn't have the guile of blue, but Threaten was a great get for red, as the color's trademark aggro rushes finally had an excellent answer to that one problem blocker that didn't involve just burning it. Starstorm was Red's first big X spell that only hit creatures, not players. This was in recognition of the efficiency of Earthquake. It was also a staple in Astral Slide decks. You'd be crazy not to first pick this in any draft. Red's the strongest color in Onslaught. I'm not going to lie, after the awesomeness of green in Odyssey block, it went back to form in Onslaught block. Aside from the elves, there weren't that many great cards. Biorhythm is on the short list that is the Commander ban list. Automatically killing anyone who doesn't own a creature, and probably bringing everyone to the brink of death, that's what I call power. Gigapede really excited me when I first saw it. I can always exchange a card in hand for it on my upkeep. It can't be targeted by removal. It costs 5 and hits for 6. This card was a blue mage's nightmare, or so we thought. It ended up being a non-entity in Standard, because control decks had too many tools to make this matter, and it was slow. Krosan Colossus plus Astral Slide was a combo many players tried. It usually didn't work out. Astral Slide was a much better dedicated control strategy piece. This reminds me of players using Momentary Blink to unmorph Akroma, Angel of Fury, in Time Spiral Standard. That worked a little bit better, but hey, let's hear it for a 9/9 that actually saw some tournament play. For a set all about tribes, this Elvish Lord wasn't all that impressive. This David Bowie wannabe, Voice of the Woods, could tap 4 other elves and itself to spit out a 7/7 elemental token. But the investment was just too much to bear. Thanks to a core set, however, elves had access to Elvish Champion, a much better lord which gave them pumps and Forest Walk. I must be addicted to drawing cards because even though there have been much better versions such as Wall of Omens or Wall of Blossoms, I still wanted to play Wall of Mulch. Walls that draw cards just call out to me. Wirewood Herald was an awesome elf because if it got in the way of an opponent, it could let you tutor up your best elf in your deck. At this point, there weren't that many great targets, but Legions and Scourge later gave us some of the most broken elves of all time. Now, this was a common. One cycle that Wizards has included in most of its Commander products that seems to slip under the radar of most players is the common cycle of cycling lands. Unlike the awkward counterparts of Urza Saga, which could cycle but for 2 mana, the Onslaught cyclers only required 1 colored mana. Now, if you were having trouble finding the colored mana to cycle it, well, you know what? It's unlikely because you just play the damn thing. These lands also combine very well with Ravnica Block's Karoo lands, which mean that you can tap the cycle land for mana, return it to hand with your Karoo, and then cycle it right then and there. Awesome stuff. And it's built into all these Commander decks. That's smart design by Wizards. While all of these lands saw play, the most commonly seen ones were Forgotten Cave and Secluded Steppe because they were in the colors for the Astral Slide deck. Let's take a short break for a very special edition of The Price is Right. Final verdict. When I was interviewing people at GP Philly, the old set that the most people said they liked was Onslaught. Now, Onslaught brought a lot of people into Magic because these players were able to identify with tribes. Picking a tribe was like picking a sports team. Each faction had a distinct flavor and road to victory beyond just its typical color association. Part of the fun of Onslaught block was seeing these crews alter over time with each new set. There was a thematic premise of growth. Now, when we compare the three sets, Onslaught's creatures were the cheapest and smallest. Legion's creatures got bigger, badder, and more costly. And Scourge went over the top with mechanics that encourage you to play with extremely expensive stuff. Now, Onslaught is a set that diverges the least from the normal formula, and that's okay. It's a starting point. Onslaught is straightforward. That's typical of design in this era. The later sets get more elaborate. There are some serious issues that Legions and Scourge bring to the format, but we'll get to that in due time. Onslaught's limited play was fairly powerful, with players cooperating in drafts to put together extremely powerful linears. That's one of the reasons that this set was so well regarded years later. But something's rotten in Denmark when you had commons that made most of the strong rares look bad. That's how good Sparksmith was. Well-Wisher was not quite as egregious, but it was up there. Back in the day, seal play, a major component of GPs and PTQs, had problems. Pools were 5-packs, not today's 6. And getting enough playables in the colors of your choice didn't always happen. So with Onslaught, you could get morphs to fill out pools, and this was an ingenious solution for this block. You could always play off-color morphs, and if you were lucky, opponents would aim precious removal at them. Wizards had created a fun, intriguing mechanic that warped the bounds of normal Magic. Face-down cards, crazy, and crazy fun. As much fun as morph is, I have to say there are a ton of numbers you had to remember. There were limits as to what a morph could be in terms of figuring out, what do they do if they have mana to flip it up. Just crunching the numbers mentally took a long time for players, which meant a lot of sitting around and staring, crunching numbers. And there were many, many, many stories of matches ending and players failing to reveal their face-down card, which led judges to give them game or match losses. Yeah. That was the downside of morph, coupled with a dominant rules enforcement philosophy that was very, very harsh, assuming that players have malicious intent. You may have won, but since you shuffled your cards back into your deck without revealing what that face-down card was, judge! This block was a major turning point as an impetus in getting judges to be more about keeping gameplay going and handling disputes rather than being school-marmish cops, because there were a lot of opportunities for enforcement. Getting warnings or future match losses for failing to reveal was a major turnoff, and I personally saw it happen so many times. It happened to me just one time. Just once in the year. That was enough to scald me enough so I learned better. But it happened again and again to some players who just weren't in control of their play habits. From this block, I learned I had to take the end games a little more seriously. But this is a lesson that really doesn't need to get hammered in so hard. Alas, Morph turned out to be a fairly straightforward affair when constructed. You knew what your opponent had face down almost every time. That was a bust. But the limited component made up for it. The tribes were excellent for new players. Throw in creatures with other creatures of the same type, and wonderful things happen. This gave players an identity to cling to beyond that of just a color. Now, I like all the colors of Magic, even if I don't personally identify with green or black that strongly. But I sure as hell understand why I identify with Azorius. Establishing order and knowledge on something undefined personally appeals to me. Tribes played the same function as Ravnica's guilds do, and each had a somewhat different mechanical feel. But not all the tribes were equals. The wizards just failed to come up in limited at this point. Clerics and soldiers never made it in constructed. The tribes that had the most energy in the past, elves and goblins, continued to hold the top position. Onslaught spawned numerous tribal decks in Standard, but it was especially guilty of printing a block monster. And not just a block monster, but a monster whose pieces were almost entirely within one set. The Astral slide deck ran barely any cards from Legions or Scourge. It got all of its cycling pieces and the 2 enchantments that provided the fuel right from the get-go with Onslaught. The only piece that came from the core sets was Wrath of God, and then later on it got Eternal Dragon. I feel this is a serious mistake by R&D. Hey, I played Astral Slide, I thought it was an awesome deck, but it didn't feel like a proper Standard deck should, since its cycling mechanics ignored the norm of how Magic behaved. It ignored the red zone for the most part. This was particularly egregious in a set that was so focused on creatures. As bad as the Astral slide deck was, well, it could have been worse. And as 2003's players will tell you, the next year it did get worse. Much worse. The biggest threat to a healthy, standard environment loomed over the horizon. But we're not going to talk about that now. Onslaught did something new, players liked it, and it wasn't totally broken. It gave control players some useful tools to stop creature decks, though interestingly, those tools were in red, not white. Onslaught also made some key fixes to the color pie that seem totally intuitive today. There are a variety of fun, fascinating Johnny cards for players not interested in the tribal thing. And as much as I love Morph as a mechanic, its luster doesn't hold up when you think of all the games players lost and tournaments made rotten by judges enforcing the end-of-game Morph reveal to the letter of the law. Now, hey, I think games should not hinge on a cleanup procedure at the end. Maybe you think I'm harping on a small detail, but I care about play experience, and Morphs were not fun for judges to enforce, and they were miserable for players to end up getting match losses by. The thing that Onslaught didn't do that Lorwyn fixed was have each faction be more intuitively cohesive. They fit together, but you had to look carefully to see all the details. In Lorwyn, each tribe was much more clear in what they were about. You know what Onslaught could have had? Later sets figured this out. Each tribe needed a keyword. Kamigawa's Samurai got Bushido, and the Spirits got Spiritcraft and Soul Shift. Each guild in Ravnica got its own keyword. Now, some of them sucked, but at least there was something easy to figure out about each faction. The Lorwyn tribes had much more synergy, and yet the effects weren't quite as swingy in relation to the power level as those of Onslaught. At this point, Magic is almost a decade old. Wizards did learn from previous mistakes and took those into account to make Onslaught, but in that process, they made a whole new bunch of mistakes. Now, this isn't condemning Onslaught because it had a host of virtues, but we have to acknowledge the bad as well as the good. I love creature fights, so I'm going to give Onslaught a 7 out of 10, quite good. This is a fun set that tried new things and brought joy to many formats. Onslaught is a success, though not on the level of later sets, so take a look at its cards, maybe go through some old boxes and put together a cube from its commons and uncommons, and give it a whirl. You'll be glad you did. Next week we assemble legions for inspection. How will it fare? Stay tuned. This is Eli Kaplan for Ancestral Recall, signing off. Good games, and good luck.